So IPCC does its thing with the integrated assessment, Earth system models, RCPs, and future scenarios. But there are independent agencies focused on specific sectors like energy, the International Energy Agency, for example, which does its own calculations looking at the market, the current energy use, and projects into the future and produces graphs like this called energy demand into the future out to 2050 in million tons of oil equivalent. Right? You use oil as an energy source, and then whatever the energy source is, you can project it onto oil equivalent. Right? So it shows that the demand is going to keep growing, which is probably not surprising, except that this probably assumes population will keep growing. This is a very controversial topic where I think I have a podcast on that, where it's not clear that population will necessarily keep increasing. The projections are that we will reach 10 billion by 2050, but there are also people who say educating women and them having fewer kids when they are rich and educated is going to start putting us below replacement level. So if we want to replace each generation with another generation, each person has to produce, each couple has to produce 2.1 children. Okay, including mortality and other things. But so these things depend on many things. Nonetheless, there are independent projections, and this is kind of the projected sources of energy. This is renewables. Coal. So coal here, you can see that even into 2040 doesn't change the amount of coal as a part of the portfolio of energy. Okay, so this is very contradictory to what climate change people would want. If you want to control climate in reduce the emissions, not only for greenhouse warming but also for health. Coal is a horrendously bad thing for human health, right? And there is plenty of coal. If we burn coal at the rate we are burning, it could last us for another 800 to 1500 years. So there is no shortage of coal, unlike the uncertainties in the amount of oil and natural gas that would be available in the next decades and centuries. Okay, natural gas increases. Natural gas is better than oil for carbon emissions, and nuclear. So you can see that nuclear changes a little bit, and nuclear remains kind of a strange issue where people are generally uncomfortable with it because of the sense of nuclear accidents and so on. But new generation of nuclear plants that are small promise safety and protection against hazards and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, in trillion kilowatts, this is the demand as it grows into the future. So these are done separately and independently. But if you look at the energy agency, International Energy Agency consumption by fuel, it shows a historical trend and then expected future trends. Okay, so you can see that in the past, nuclear has not really increased. There are complications because France, for example, relies a lot on nuclear. Japan used to rely a lot on nuclear till the earthquake and the tsunami in 2011 damaged the Fukushima nuclear plant, and then they got scared, but there is some argument that they were already moving away from it and increasing their carbon footprint, and then they decided to go for coal and so on and so forth. So these are always issues one has to worry about. When a pandemic comes or when financial crises happen, countries have to make a choice on economic development versus climate change, and you can obviously be intuitively clear that climate change will not be the top priority, right? For countries that are going to grow, trying to grow economically, or countries that are already rich, climate change is going to always take a back seat. Okay, so nonetheless, here it is. Coal continues to increase in this scenario from Energy Information. Sorry, this is the Energy Information Administration of USA. Out into 2030, 2040, coal is actually increasing here. Natural gas is increasing. Liquids and nuclear reactors, a tiny bit of increase. Renewables increase, but still not a huge chunk of the total energy. So far, renewables are only 10% or with less than 15%, even for the most progressive countries like Germany. So when are we going to replace coal and other carbon-rich fuel types with carbon neutral or carbon renewable sources? That's not very easy. Okay, so IPCC says what kind of upscaling of low carbon energy supply will be needed to meet different scenarios. So you have produced different scenarios of carbon levels like 580 to 720 ppm CO2 equivalent, 480 to 530, and so on. So 430 to 480. So you have various levels of carbon in the atmosphere that you have developed the scenarios for. Then you have to go back and say, what kind of energy sources would we need to meet those targets, right? So you need upscaling of low carbon energy supply starting from 2030. Here they all go from 2030 to 2050 and 2100 for different levels of carbon CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. And you can see that the upscaling required obviously jumps up when you want to keep the CO2 low. The lower the CO2 you want to achieve, the faster and the higher upscaling of low carbon energy supply you will need. So essentially you will need to have low energy intensity of the GDP for each country and low carbon intensity of the energy production for each country. So upscaling low carbon energy supply is going to be a big part of the strategy to get there. How? Nobody knows. It's just a suggestion that this is how we can get there. But as I said, it's not easy because technology is not necessarily available, and it's not even clear that rich countries who may have it will share it with the developing countries. Even though global warming is everybody's problem, it does create winners and losers. So unlike ozone hole, for example, where every living species would be hurt by increased UV radiation, global warming is not going to hurt everybody. For example, if Siberia gets warm, they will grow lots of wheat over there, and they can become the breadbasket of the world. If Arctic ice melts away, all the countries are already fighting for a chunk of the Arctic Ocean because there is potentially a lot of fossil fuel and natural gas under there. Because remember, in the past, when it was very warm and there was no Arctic sea ice, there would have been photosynthesis, and a lot of the hydrocarbon is buried in there. Antarctica is similarly colonized by many countries because if the ice melts, everybody wants to have a chunk of Antarctica. So, complicated issues, but nonetheless, there is a negotiation going on under UNFCCC where all the countries participate. Complications about which country has agreed to follow up and not, and so on, but it's fairly clear that companies are being aware of their energy intensity, their water use being sustainable, being renewable, and so on and so forth. So this train may be moving in the right direction. The question is how to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference, as it's called. We'll talk about that a little bit later.